On the evening of March 25, 2022, life in the quiet suburb of Mayfield carried on as usual. Among the rows of modest apartment complexes lining Krebert Street stood McKenzie's unit, unassuming and tucked within the peaceful surroundings of the neighborhood. As the night progressed, unsettling sounds began to pierce the stillness. Neighbors later recounted hearing raised voices, an argument escalating in intensity. One concerned resident, unable to ignore the sense of danger, made the crucial decision to contact emergency services. They feared this was no ordinary domestic dispute. Something felt terribly wrong. When officers from the Newcastle City Police District responded to the call, they arrived to a harrowing scene. They were quickly joined by paramedics, who rushed inside with equipment and urgency, trying to stabilize the situation and save a life. But despite their swift and determined efforts, the outcome was devastating. McKenzie had suffered critical injuries so severe that nothing could be done to bring her back. Tragically, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us. Born and raised in the coastal city of Newcastle, located in the heart of New South Wales, Australia, McKenzie's story began in a community known for its laid-back charm, tight-knit neighborhoods, and deep sense of belonging. From her earliest years, she was surrounded by a loving and supportive family unit that provided a strong foundation for her values and resilience. Her mother, Tabitha Ackret, worked as a dental hygienist, dedicating herself not only to her career, but also wholeheartedly to raising her daughter with care, patience, and strength. The mother-daughter bond between Tabitha and McKenzie was undeniable, one that would later shine through in the heartfelt tributes Tabitha shared, revealing the depth of her grief and the pride she felt in the woman her daughter had become. McKenzie's family life extended beyond her biological parents. She shared a meaningful and affectionate relationship with her stepfather, who played a vital role in her upbringing, treating her as his own and supporting her through both joyful moments and difficult times. Her inner circle of friends described her as the beating heart of their group, the one who could always lighten a heavy moment with humor and who offered warmth, loyalty, and empathy to those around her. McKenzie was known for her infectious laugh, her ability to find beauty in everyday moments, and her remarkable capacity to connect with others, often using social media platforms like TikTok to share glimpses into her life. Through short, candid videos, she brought laughter, inspiration, and a sense of authenticity that resonated with many, especially other young mothers navigating similar paths. Her young son, just 23 months old, was the light of her life and her greatest motivation. Every decision she made revolved around his well-being, his happiness, and the future she hoped to build for him. Despite the challenges that came her way, McKenzie remained steadfast in her commitment to creating a safe, loving, and secure environment for her child. Life had not been without its trials. By her early 20s, she found herself facing the often overwhelming responsibilities of single parenthood. Living in a modest unit on Krebert Street, McKenzie juggled the demands of daily life with quiet determination, never losing sight of her dreams for a better tomorrow. Those close to her said she often spoke about breaking cycles, of hardship, of instability, and of fear, and building a life filled with hope and opportunity for her son. But there was a shadow that loomed large in McKenzie's life, one that she had been trying to escape for some time. Her relationship with her former partner, Tyrone Thompson, began in late 2019. What started as a seemingly ordinary romance soon evolved into a turbulent and emotionally exhausting cycle of highs and lows. By October 25, 21, the situation had escalated to a point of serious concern. Thompson was arrested and subsequently jailed for actions that included causing harm to McKenzie, engaging in threatening behavior, and damaging her belongings. He was sentenced to a short period of imprisonment with a non-parole period of just over 4 months and was released on March 9, 2022. To protect her from further contact or distress, an apprehended violence order was issued, legally prohibiting Thompson from approaching or communicating with McKenzie in any form. Despite this legal protection, McKenzie continued to live in a state of persistent anxiety. Those closest to her revealed that she feared the AVO would not be enough to deter him once he was back on the outside. Her concern was not unwarranted. In a deeply concerning message to a friend, she confided, My ex Tyrone just got out of jail from what he did to me and is still being weird and harassing me. He couldn't last 24 hours. These words, written with a mix of weariness and fear, would later haunt those who read them. After his release, Thompson reportedly began contacting McKenzie almost immediately, disregarding the restrictions placed upon him. He reached out via phone calls and through various social media platforms, circumventing the order and escalating her sense of vulnerability. Friends said she felt torn between the residual emotional ties to someone she once cared for and the increasing sense of unease over his continued presence in her life. There was an unspoken tension, one that suggested she was holding on to hope for calm, even as the warning signs mounted. A tragic and poignant detail later emerged from the days leading up to the incident. For Christmas 2021, McKenzie had asked her family for a set of kitchen knives, an entirely ordinary and practical gift, a symbol of her efforts to build a functional, well-equipped home for her and her son. It was an innocent request that, in hindsight, would take on an unbearably somber meaning. On the night of March 25th, 2022, life in the peaceful suburb of Mayfield unfolded like any other. The neighborhood, filled with unassuming apartment blocks and familiar faces, was the kind of place where residents exchanged polite nods, where front porches held potted plants, and where parents strolled with prams in the early evening light. McKenzie's apartment was part of this world, a small, humble unit within a quiet complex on Crebert Street. That evening, McKenzie was not alone. A male friend, whose identity remained confidential in initial reports, was visiting. And at some point, Tyrone Thompson appeared at the apartment. How exactly he gained entry remains uncertain. What is known is that he had been explicitly instructed, both legally and personally, not to be there. Reports would later confirm that he had been asked repeatedly to leave that night. His failure to do so marked a turning point, one that would soon result in irreversible consequences. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices, the sounds of an argument cutting through the stillness of the night. Alarmed by the escalation, one neighbor placed a call to emergency services, sensing that the situation unfolding was more than a domestic disagreement. It was something far more serious. Though the contents of that emergency call were not made public, officials confirmed that the urgency and distress conveyed were clear enough to prompt a rapid response. When officers from the Newcastle City Police District arrived, they were met with a deeply troubling scene. Paramedics joined law enforcement at the apartment in an urgent attempt to provide aid. Despite every effort made by first responders, it was tragically too late. McKenzie's injuries were severe and she could not be revived. She was pronounced deceased at the scene, leaving behind a heartbroken family, a devastated circle of friends, and a son. The aftermath of the tragedy sent shockwaves throughout the community. Questions were raised about the effectiveness of protective measures, the persistent challenges faced by survivors. Local police commander, Superintendent Wayne Humphrey, later addressed the media with a somber tone that reflected the magnitude of what had unfolded. He described the scene encountered by first responders as deeply disturbing and profoundly confronting. What authorities found when they arrived at the apartment block on Crebert Street would leave a lasting mark on those involved in the response. It was not simply a crime scene. It was a scene of devastation, grief, and unthinkable loss. Among the first observations made by officers was the presence of a man, later officially identified as 22-year-old Tyrone Thompson, positioned at the top of the building's communal staircase. He sat cross-legged, his posture unusually calm, yet his voice reportedly loud and insistent. Witnesses and officers described him as demanding immediate medical attention for a visible injury to his hand. Despite the circumstances, he appeared to be more concerned with his own condition than with the tragedy that had just occurred mere steps away. Officers, although trained to compartmentalize during traumatic situations, were faced with the grim and urgent task of responding to what had clearly been an life-altering incident. Lying near McKenzie, investigators located the broken remains of a kitchen knife, its blade separated from the handle, both fragments stained and sitting as mute evidence of what had taken place. This discovery, though clinical in nature, was emotionally jarring. The knife was quickly confirmed to be part of the set McKenzie had received as a Christmas gift, a practical and well-meaning present from her family. No one could have imagined it would one day be involved in such a heart-wrenching outcome. Immediately following his detainment at the scene, Thompson was arrested by police and placed under guard before being transported to John Hunter Hospital. His hand injury, while treated promptly, raised immediate and serious questions about the circumstances of the night and his direct involvement in the events that had transpired. The sequence of events that led to this tragic night, however, had not appeared out of nowhere. It had been quietly building, layer by layer, in the weeks following Thompson's release from incarceration. After serving a brief sentence for his previous assault on McKenzie, Thompson walked free from prison on March 9, 2022. Despite the conditions of an active apprehended violence order, a legal protection intended to prevent any contact with McKenzie, he began violating the terms almost immediately. Within days of his release, Thompson began reaching out again. He called her, sent her messages from various social media accounts, and even contacted individuals connected to McKenzie's new relationship. This relentless pattern of contact wasn't just unwelcome. It was illegal and deeply distressing for McKenzie, who had already lived through trauma and intimidation at his hands. As later confirmed by court records and interviews with friends, McKenzie found herself in a frightening emotional and psychological limbo. Despite the AVO and her desire to move on, she struggled to fully separate from Thompson's persistent efforts to re-enter her life. During the 6 days leading up to March 25th, she reportedly spent extended periods of time with him, likely out of fear, coercion, or the complexity of trying to keep peace for her child's sake. Friends said McKenzie often felt she had no viable path out, caught in a place where fear of escalation made even the thought of resisting his presence feel risky. On the night in question, McKenzie hosted a small gathering at her apartment. Present were Tyrone Thompson and another man, a friend of McKenzie's whose name remained protected in early reporting due to the sensitive nature of the case. While the dynamics among those in the apartment remain partially unclear, what is certain is that tension mounted over the course of the evening. The male friend reportedly left the apartment at some point, but a gut feeling led him to return later. What he walked into was a scene that would leave him shaken and horrified, a moment that he would later describe to police as something he could never forget. In the weeks leading up to this tragic outcome, McKenzie had been trying to take steps to protect herself. Evidence later presented in court and revealed by investigators showed that she had reached out to advocacy and domestic safety organizations, expressing a growing concern for her safety. She emailed requests for advice on implementing home security measures, asking for assistance in installing cameras, upgrading door locks, and creating a safer living space for herself and her child. Her actions were those of someone who understood the risks she faced and who was doing everything within her power to reclaim a sense of control and protection. The events of March 25th were not a spontaneous incident. They were, tragically, the culmination of an ongoing pattern of intimidation and disregard for boundaries. Tyrone Thompson had been sentenced in October 2021 after being found guilty of assaulting McKenzie, damaging her property, and engaging in threatening behavior. However, the system allowed him to re-enter her life after serving only a short sentence, and only 16 days after his release, the worst-case scenario unfolded. The AVO, intended to serve as a safeguard for McKenzie, ultimately proved insufficient. Despite her warnings, despite the legal boundaries in place, the document designed to protect her failed to keep danger at bay. As the initial response subsided and the reality of the situation set in, the Newcastle City Police District formally launched a major investigation. The operation was designated Strikeforce Slant, signaling the beginning of a comprehensive inquiry designed to uncover every detail, every decision, and every moment that had led to this tragedy. The investigation began with a painstaking review of the crime scene. Forensic specialists and detectives spent hours inside McKenzie's unit, examining every room, every corner, and every item for clues. The apartment told a story in objects. Overturned furniture hinted, scattered belongings suggested panic and urgency. The veranda where McKenzie had been found was a focal point for the forensic team. Marked by dark stains and shattered fragments of the broken knife, it was a place that bore silent witness to a heartbreaking confrontation. Digital evidence soon emerged as a vital pillar of the case. Investigators analyzed McKenzie's mobile phone, uncovering messages, call logs, and communication threads that illustrated the full scope of her interactions with Thompson after his release. Some of the messages were pleading, others resigned, and some even strangely civil, showing the emotional complexity of their connection. This mix of fear, fatigue, and hope told a deeper story, one of a woman navigating the impossible terrain between survival and stability. Thompson's digital footprint also extended beyond McKenzie. He had contacted people associated with her new relationship, messaging them, probing for information, or attempting to reassert influence over her life. These communications, once retrieved from servers and matched with telecommunications records, showed a clear pattern of breaches against the standing AVO. Investigators also spoke at length with McKenzie's close contacts. Her mother, Tabitha Ackrit, gave a deeply moving statement, sharing insight into her daughter's final days. McKenzie lived in constant fear after Tyrone's release, she said during court proceedings. She told me he wouldn't let her go. Her words echoed what McKenzie had reportedly confided to friends. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, unable to move forward, and unsure how to escape the shadow that Thompson had cast over her. One of McKenzie's friends told officers that she had made her child's safety her top priority, and yet, no matter what steps she took, she couldn't see a clear way out. The emotional toll was immense. The friend described her as someone who wanted nothing more than peace. A life free from fear, where her son could grow up without trauma, and where she could finally begin healing from the wounds of the past. During the hours that followed his arrest, Tyrone Thompson was questioned by detectives under formal interview conditions, a procedure that marked a critical turning point in the unfolding investigation. His demeanor during the sessions was described as guarded, reserved, yet revealing in key ways. As the conversations progressed, inconsistencies began to emerge, raising further concerns for the officers overseeing the case. Although he maintained a tone of cooperation, his narrative shifted under pressure, a red flag for experienced investigators. According to court documents later cited by the Newcastle Herald, Thompson initially described the tragic event as a misunderstanding, one born from heightened emotions and a breakdown in communication. He acknowledged being at Mackenzie Anderson's apartment that night. When asked how he justified this, he claimed that McKenzie herself had invited him. His explanation painted a version of events where he was not only welcome, but allegedly there in hopes of reconciling or at least communicating peacefully. As the interview progressed, Thompson offered a version of events in which a heated argument had erupted, escalating quickly into a confrontation. He alleged that McKenzie had been the one to introduce a weapon into the situation, claiming she was holding a kitchen knife in what he described as a moment of emotional intensity. He told police that his hand injury had been the result of attempting to protect himself, claiming he had tried to take the knife from her. "She came at me, and I just reacted," he reportedly said, suggesting his actions were defensive, not premeditated or retaliatory. However, this narrative, while initially structured to appear plausible, did not withstand the scrutiny of detailed police questioning. The detectives noticed discrepancies in the timeline he offered. His story shifted in subtle ways each time it was retold. The account failed to align with physical evidence collected from the scene, including the broken knife, split into blade and handle, as well as the nature of McKenzie's injuries and witness statements describing her visible fear in the days and hours before the incident. Investigators continued pressing him, not only about the night in question, but also about his actions leading up to it. They presented clear evidence showing that he had contacted McKenzie numerous times following his release from custody on March 9, 2022. Thompson attempted to downplay the significance of these actions, framing them as emotional outreach and an effort to clear the air. He claimed his intention was never harmful, that he merely sought closure or reconnection due to their complicated past. However, these justifications stood in sharp contrast to McKenzie's own written communications to advocacy organizations, where she expressed ongoing fear and the strong belief that he would come after her again. The detectives also investigated the possible impact of another figure who had been in McKenzie's life at the time, a male friend who was present at her apartment earlier that evening. Officers questioned Thompson about whether feelings of jealousy or perceived rivalry could have played a role in the escalation. Although he dismissed the suggestion, the possibility of emotional provocation added another layer to the psychological profile being built around the case. As Thompson remained in custody and the legal proceedings advanced, the evidence against him grew more substantial. A forensic report issued during the investigation confirmed that McKenzie's DNA had been found on the blade of the broken knife, while Thompson's DNA was located on the handle, significantly undermining his claims of merely trying to defend himself. These forensic connections were crucial in establishing a clearer understanding of the confrontation and his proximity to the weapon. On March 27, 2022, formal charges were brought against Tyrone Thompson. These included a charge of murder, multiple counts of breach of arrest, and additional offenses relating to his behavior, both on the night of the tragedy and in the lead-up to it. The murder charge was anchored in a body of compelling evidence, ranging from DNA analysis and digital records to eyewitness testimony and Thompson's own admissions. The charge sheet also cited patterns of threatening behavior, reinforcing the view that his actions had not occurred in a vacuum but were instead part of an escalating pattern of control and intimidation. Though Thompson never clearly articulated a motive, the investigation, led by Strikeforce Slant and supported by experts in domestic violence cases, uncovered troubling patterns. According to those familiar with the case, including social workers and analysts who were brought in to interpret the emotional dynamics, Thompson's repeated violations of court orders and refusal to accept McKenzie's separation pointed to a deeper psychological motive: control. They concluded that his inability to accept the end of their relationship, combined with his knowledge that she was trying to move on and protect her son, drove a need to reassert power over her life. The presence of another male on the night of March 25th may have served as a trigger, intensifying his already obsessive behavior. Although the charges marked a meaningful step toward justice, they also served as a sobering reminder of the systemic issues that had allowed this situation to escalate. The enforcement of the order had failed to stop contact. Despite McKenzie's repeated attempts to seek help, including her requests for increased home security and documented communications with support services, the danger had remained real and unrelenting. By early 2025, the case reached a pivotal chapter. The legal proceedings progressed to the Supreme Court of New South Wales in Newcastle, with the trial scheduled to begin on April 7th of that year. It was expected to last approximately 4 weeks, and both the prosecution and defense had prepared for an intense and emotionally taxing process. However, just days before the trial was set to begin, there was a dramatic shift. On April 1st, 2025, less than a week before opening arguments, Tyrone Thompson entered a guilty plea in open court. At 25 years old, after years of denial and a continued not guilty stance, he pleaded guilty to the domestic violence-related murder of McKenzie Anderson. The plea stunned those in attendance, bringing the long-awaited resolution to a case that had gripped the Newcastle community and beyond. This unexpected development eliminated the need for a full trial, sparing McKenzie's loved ones from reliving the details in a public courtroom setting. But while the plea avoided a drawn-out judicial process, it shifted the emotional weight to the sentencing phase, where the court would deliberate on the consequences Thompson should face for his actions. The sentencing hearing was presided over by Justice Richard Weinstein. In the courtroom, Crown Prosecutor Brendan Queen led the case for the state, presenting a powerful and comprehensive account of the impact McKenzie's death had caused. The prosecution emphasized not just the physical evidence and timeline of events, but also the psychological and emotional toll inflicted upon McKenzie in the months leading up to the tragedy. Central to the prosecution's argument was McKenzie's ongoing vulnerability. They presented her emails to advocacy organizations, in which she had clearly outlined her fears and detailed the persistent sense of danger she lived with. The court heard how McKenzie had expressed deep concern that Tyrone Thompson would not allow her to move on with her life peacefully. These communications highlighted her repeated efforts to seek safety and the systematic failure of those protections to shield her from further harm. The legal proceedings surrounding Tyrone Thompson's sentencing reached an emotionally charged and highly scrutinized point as both sides presented their final arguments to the court. The defense team, representing Thompson, acknowledged the weight of what had occurred and the irreversible pain inflicted upon McKenzie Anderson and her loved ones. However, in seeking leniency from the court, they brought forth a set of mitigating factors they hoped would be considered during sentencing. As outlined in reports by Newcastle Weekly and other local outlets, the defense argued that Thompson's actions, while undeniably tragic, had taken place within the context of significant personal challenges. They cited his history of mental health difficulties, as well as a turbulent and disadvantaged upbringing, as contributing factors that may have impaired his ability to manage conflict and regulate his emotional responses. His legal counsel emphasized that while Thompson was not experiencing psychosis or a diagnosable psychological break at the time of the incident, he was, in their words, emotionally unstable. And this instability played a key role in the escalation that led to McKenzie's death. As part of the defense's submissions, an apology letter written by Thompson was entered into the court record. In the letter, he expressed remorse, writing, "No words can undo the pain and devastation I caused to someone I genuinely loved." The statement, while emotional on its surface, was met with skepticism from the prosecution and later from the bench itself. Crown Prosecutor Brendan Queen challenged the depth and sincerity of Thompson's claimed remorse. He pointed specifically to portions of Thompson's letter that appeared to shift partial responsibility back onto McKenzie, most notably, the line describing their relationship. Queen argued that this type of language subtly invoked a narrative of shared fault, and by doing so, suggested elements of victim blaming. In a case centered on control, intimidation, and repeated breaches of protective orders, this characterization struck a nerve not only in the courtroom, but among those observing the case publicly. Justice Richard Weinstein, presiding over the proceedings, also questioned the genuine intent behind the apology. While he acknowledged that remorse, when sincere, can be an important factor in sentencing, he remarked that the letter offered limited insight into Thompson's internal reckoning or emotional accountability. Expressions of regret must be weighed against actions, the judge noted, and in this case, the evidence speaks louder than the words. On May 1st, 2025, Justice Weinstein handed down the long-awaited sentence. Tyrone Thompson was sentenced to 22 years and 6 months in prison, with a non-parole period of 15 years and 6 months, meaning he would be eligible to apply for parole no earlier than October 2038. In delivering the verdict, the judge characterized the incident not as a spontaneous mistake, but as a frenzied act, one that exhibited a level of intensity and disregard that left a young mother lifeless, a child motherless, and a family shattered. Justice Weinstein gave careful consideration to the aggravating factors. He pointed to Thompson's prior history, his repeated breaches of legal orders, and the fact that McKenzie had been living in a state of documented fear in the weeks leading up to her death. Her vulnerability and repeated attempts to seek safety were weighed heavily in the judgment. However, in balancing these factors, the judge also took into account the guilty plea, which, while late in the process, spared the family the trauma of a full-length trial, and Thompson's personal circumstances, including his mental health history and reported efforts to engage in rehabilitation. The sentence immediately sparked a wave of public and personal outrage, especially from McKenzie's grieving family, who had waited years for justice to be served. Outside the Newcastle Supreme Court, McKenzie's mother, Tabitha Ackritt, collapsed in tears while speaking to reporters. Her voice, heavy with heartbreak, cut through the noise of legal language and courtroom decorum. "Whilst this might be thought of as a good outcome for the courts," she said, "we are disgusted that this sentence is what they think the value of my daughter's life was worth." Her statement was more than just the voice of a mourning mother. It became a rallying cry. Tabitha described the sentence as an insult to women everywhere, particularly those who live under the shadow of coercion, fear. She called upon the justice system to rise to the standard that the community expects, to send a clear message that such acts would not be met with soft consequences. Her plea was emotional, raw, and fiercely driven by the hope that no other family would have to endure what hers had. Just under 2 weeks later, on May 14, 2025, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions DPP announced that it would formally appeal the sentence, arguing that it was manifestly inadequate, given the gravity of the offense. Prosecutors stated that the original term did not adequately reflect the seriousness of the actions, the breach of legal protection, and the long-standing pattern of intimidation and control that preceded the fatal incident. The announcement was met with relief by McKenzie's family and supporters. Tabitha, speaking once again to media outlets, expressed gratitude and cautious optimism. "This is the first hurdle to getting a sentence that is more in line with community and moral standards," she said. "We know nothing will bring McKenzie back, but we hope the legal system will recognize that justice must be more than symbolic." The appeal hearing was scheduled for August 8, 2025, set to take place over a 2-hour session in the Court of Criminal Appeal. Legal analysts noted the significance of the case, not only for its emotional weight, but for its potential to influence how domestic violence-related homicide is approached in sentencing moving forward. Prosecutors indicated they would be urging the court to increase Thompson's sentence substantially, citing the need to set a firm precedent, one that communicates the seriousness of such crimes and the judiciary's commitment to protecting vulnerable individuals. As of now, Thompson remains in prison, his future pending the outcome of the appeal. For McKenzie's family, the legal journey is far from over, yet their advocacy has evolved into something bigger than any single case. They are now working to raise awareness about systemic failures, the importance of enforcing protection orders, and the urgent need to support those seeking help before danger escalates. McKenzie's young son, now being raised by her relatives in a home filled with love and remembrance, represents both the loss and the legacy left behind. The fight for justice has become about more than a sentence. It's about sending a message that society must take domestic violence seriously at every stage. From the first signs of coercion to the most tragic outcomes, there is a collective responsibility to respond swiftly and meaningfully. As the court prepares to revisit Thompson's sentence, one question remains at the heart of public discourse. Will the justice system rise to meet the moment and deliver a sentence that truly reflects the cost of McKenzie Anderson's life? Or will it fall short once again? The answer will not only shape the outcome of one case, but could set the tone for many others still to come. On the morning of October 17th, emergency services received a frantic 911 call. The caller was a man named Philip. Although his voice was laced with panic, there was something unsettlingly calm and controlled about his tone. He told the dispatcher that he had just returned home from a jog, only to discover a horrifying scene. His partner, Anna, was unconscious in the bathtub. The 911 operator immediately took charge, instructing Philip on what to do. First, drain the water from the tub. Next, finally, begin CPR and continue until help arrived. Every second mattered. Yet during the entire duration of the call, the operator could still hear the persistent sound of splashing water in the background. When paramedics arrived at the residence, they found Anna unresponsive. She was rushed to the nearest hospital with urgency. Doctors and medical staff fought to revive her, doing everything they could. Tragically, despite their best efforts, Anna could not be saved. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. This is a tale of love, faith, betrayal, and a truth that simmered in the shadows for years before finally coming to light. It's the story of a woman whose spirit could brighten a room, a man who outwardly lived a life of purpose but harbored secrets darker than anyone could have imagined, and the long, painful path that would lead to revelation. Philip Grandine's journey began in the late 1980s in the quiet suburbs of Ontario, Canada. From the very start, he seemed to shine in every setting he entered. Family, friends, and classmates alike spoke of him as a magnetic presence, articulate, confident, and intellectually gifted. Teachers remembered him not just as a straight-A student, but as someone who made others want to try harder. His natural leadership skills, paired with a sharp mind, made him stand out early on. In 2003, at just 17 years old, Philip surprised his community by entering the Miss Paris Fair competition, an event traditionally open only to young women, which was later renamed to the Ambassador of the Paris Fair to reflect its evolving inclusivity. His participation made headlines across local news outlets, not just because of the novelty, but because Philip was so well loved and respected. And despite the competition's history, he excelled, ultimately earning the runner-up position. The pageant celebrated youth leadership, public speaking, and community involvement, all traits Philip had in abundance. By the following year, Philip had graduated at the top of his school district. His report card wasn't the only impressive thing. His dedication to service and his ever-deepening commitment to faith marked him as someone destined for ministry. He enrolled in theological studies soon after, and in 2007, he achieved what many in his community had long expected. He became a pastor at the Inner Day Road Evangelical Baptist Church. That was also the year his life changed in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was there that he met Anna. Anna Grandine's journey to that moment was very different from Philip's. She was born on November 10th, 1981, in the Philippines. the cherished daughter of Maria and Roman Grandine, and the protective older sister to her sibling Hannah. In 1994, when Anna was 13, her family made the life-changing move to Toronto, Canada, driven by the hope of creating a brighter future. From the beginning, Anna was known for her determination and grace. Teachers admired her discipline. Friends were drawn to her kind spirit and warm, steady presence. Even while juggling part-time jobs, Anna excelled academically. She studied human biology and archaeology at the University of Toronto, earning her degree with honors in 2006. Shortly after graduating, she found employment in a well-regarded risk assessment firm located in downtown Toronto. A demanding job, but one she handled with poise and diligence. Yet what truly set Anna apart was her inner light. Those who knew her often described her as radiant, a person whose faith gave her an extraordinary resilience. Despite being diagnosed with a chronic liver condition, a lifelong illness she rarely discussed, Anna refused to be defined by it. Instead, she used her faith as her compass, attending weekly services, volunteering in church events, and quietly uplifting others with her enduring optimism. It was within this context of devotion and quiet strength that she and Philip met. Their shared love for God, community, and service drew them together quickly. In many ways, they seemed like a perfect match. Two kind souls deeply rooted in faith, both with a passion for helping others. Their relationship blossomed almost effortlessly. After a courtship marked by prayer, long conversations, and shared dreams of a future built on faith, they were married in a traditional Christian ceremony surrounded by loved ones. They moved into a humble yet cozy bungalow in Scarborough, Ontario. It was modest, but it was theirs. A space where they hoped to build a family and live out their calling as a couple devoted to both ministry and community. 3 years later, their prayers were answered in the form of joyous news. Anna was expecting. The pregnancy brought a wave of excitement. She nicknamed the baby Jelly Ding, a playful term of endearment that captured her whimsical side. Her joy at the prospect of motherhood was uncontainable. Friends said she positively glowed. For a time, life felt complete. But beneath the surface, a different story was unfolding, one that would unravel the peace they had so carefully built. In August 2011, Anna's world began to crumble. What she discovered shook her to the core. Philip, the man she had stood beside through vows and prayers, was having an affair. And not just with any woman, but with someone Anna had called a friend. This woman was also a member of their church, someone Anna had trusted, prayed with, and welcomed into her home. The betrayal struck like lightning, but that wasn't the only secret Philip had kept hidden. Alongside the affair, Anna learned that her husband had been consuming adult content regularly, behavior that sharply contradicted the teachings he delivered each Sunday from the pulpit. For a man who preached purity and discipline, it was a devastating hypocrisy. Yet in the face of this dual betrayal, Anna's response was not rage. Instead, she remained calm and composed. Those close to her say it was her faith that gave her strength. Though deeply hurt, she chose not to lash out. She expressed a genuine willingness to forgive, not only Philip, but even the woman who had helped dismantle their marriage. But forgiveness, as Anna would come to learn, does not always restore what's broken. Determined to save her marriage, Anna sought a path forward. She reached out to someone both she and Philip respected, Stephen, a longtime friend and fellow pastor. When she confided in him about the affair and the deeper issues plaguing their relationship, Stephen listened without judgment. He agreed to help and suggested weekly counseling sessions as a way to begin healing. Philip agreed to the plan. To those in the room, he seemed remorseful, even repentant. He spoke about wanting to change, about regaining the trust of the woman he had hurt so deeply. But as the sessions unfolded, Stephen began to notice troubling signs, patterns that suggested the problems went beyond infidelity. As the weeks passed, it became clear that Philip's internal struggles ran deep. His compulsive behavior, particularly his persistent viewing of explicit material, pointed to a more serious concern, one that risked undermining not only his marriage, but his role as a spiritual leader. Stephen, weighing both personal loyalty and pastoral responsibility, eventually recommended that Philip step down from his position as pastor. Keeping him in that role, especially while his former mistress still attended the church, would create ongoing tension and confusion among the congregation. Philip initially resisted. Stepping down would mean acknowledging his failings publicly, something his pride struggled to accept. But eventually he agreed, formally resigning from the church leadership. To the outside world, the move seemed amicable. But inside the Grandine household, the atmosphere was shifting. As fall settled over Ontario in 2011, the Grandine household seemed to return to a fragile sense of normalcy, or so it appeared to outsiders. After the storm of betrayal, confession, and therapy, Philip Grandine gave the impression of a man trying to turn his life around. Following Pastor Stephen's guidance, he agreed to several restorative measures, one of which involved filtering access to questionable websites on his personal devices. These safeguards were not only meant to curb unhealthy habits, but also to rebuild trust and shift his focus toward repairing the damage he had inflicted on his marriage. Stephen had strongly urged Philip to take these steps, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to reclaim the man he once claimed to be. "Your marriage can only heal," Stephen told him in one session, "if you cut off access to the temptations that led you astray. You can't live in two worlds." Philip nodded, promising compliance. He assured Stephen and Anna that he was done with the secrecy, done with the behaviors that had jeopardized everything. And to many, it looked as though he was making progress. He secured a new job, working as both a nurse and managerial staff member at a local retirement home. The position, one that carried significant responsibility and required compassion, seemed like a step in the right direction. Colleagues described him as professional and polite, always showing up on time, always willing to lend a hand. From a distance, Philip's life was falling back into place. The scandal appeared to be behind him. But not everything seen from the outside reflects the truth beneath the surface. Despite the therapy sessions, despite resigning from his pastoral role, and despite promising his wife a fresh start, Philip had not ended his affair. In fact, he had simply grown more cautious, more calculated. He refined his deception, choosing his moments more carefully and coordinating clandestine meetings with the woman who had once been welcomed into their home as a friend. The affair, now deepened by months of secrecy, took on an even more troubling dimension. Their rendezvous were often held in discreet, dimly lit areas, sometimes in his vehicle, other times in tucked-away parking lots or quiet public spaces where they hoped to avoid familiar eyes. There was no longer any pretense of remorse, only careful planning. And while Philip played the role of the rehabilitated husband, Anna's instincts whispered a different truth. Anna was never the type to leap to suspicion without cause. But she had always been perceptive, sensitive to changes in tone, timing, and emotional presence. Something about Philip's demeanor didn't sit right. His phone, once left out in the open, was now always locked and face down. His explanations for late arrivals became vague. And though he was polite, the warmth that once defined their relationship had chilled. In early October of that year, the tension finally reached a boiling point. During what was supposed to be a routine couples therapy session, Anna confronted Philip again about the affair. She had seen enough, heard enough, felt enough to know in her bones that he wasn't being honest. Her voice, though calm, was firm. She asked him directly, was it still happening? Was he still seeing her? Philip didn't answer right away. Days later, on the morning of October 14th, Anna, now 7 months pregnant, checked herself into a local hospital. She reported feeling faint, dizzy, and overwhelmingly fatigued, symptoms that alarmed the attending staff. Medical personnel quickly admitted her for observation, noting her pregnancy and her history of liver-related complications. While waiting in the emergency room, Anna made a phone. What she said during that conversation would later become haunting. She told Hannah that her symptoms began shortly after drinking a smoothie Philip had made for her that morning. She recalled how strange it had tasted, and more disturbingly, how she had joked, half serious, about whether he might have put something in it. When she asked Philip directly, he had brushed it off with a laugh and reassured her that everything was fine. But Anna's body told a different story. Toxicology screening revealed the presence of a sedative compound, one that is strictly contraindicated during pregnancy. Not only could it induce harmful effects in adults, but its use on a pregnant woman posed serious risks to both her and the unborn child. Medical staff took the results seriously, but Anna's condition eventually stabilized, and she was released the following day under orders to rest. No one knew it would be her final visit to the hospital. 3 days later, on the afternoon of October 17th, emergency services received a frantic 911 call. It was Philip. His voice, though panicked, was oddly composed. He told the dispatcher that he had returned home from a jog to find Anna unconscious in the bathtub. The 911 operator acted immediately, guiding him step by step. Drain the water, lift her out of the tub, begin CPR. Time was of the essence. But instead of following instructions, Philip hesitated. He claimed he couldn't perform CPR. Despite his nursing background, despite years of medical training, he told the dispatcher he didn't know how. He also said that Anna was too slippery to lift, an excuse that baffled first responders. The operator advised using towels to absorb the water and create friction. But throughout the call, the sound of water splashing continued in the background, proof that no attempt had been made to remove her from the tub. When paramedics arrived at the scene, they found Anna. She was quickly transported to the hospital. Despite the medical team's best efforts, neither she could be saved. She was only 29 years old. Philip was brought in for questioning that same evening. For over 2 hours, detectives spoke with him, documenting his account, recording inconsistencies. Then, to the shock of many, he was released the following day. Not long after, he reached out to Pastor Stephen to discuss funeral arrangements. It was during this conversation that Stephen suggested something he believed was deeply symbolic: purchasing a double burial plot so that Philip and Anna could one day rest side by side. Philip's response was cold and immediate. He declined the idea, stating casually that he might remarry in the future and wouldn't want to be buried next to Anna. For Stephen, the comment was chilling. Out of place, emotionally detached, and disturbingly pragmatic given the circumstances. On October 30th, Anna's funeral was held at Jarvis Baptist Church, where she had once led prayer groups, volunteered with the youth ministry, and sung in the choir. The church was filled with grief. Friends, relatives, and members of the community gathered to honor a life that had touched many. But one guest stood out, and not in a comforting way. The woman at the center of the affair, the one Anna had trusted as a friend, attended the funeral. Her presence shocked mourners, and Philip, instead of distancing himself, stood silently beside her throughout the ceremony. For many in attendance, the sight was not just inappropriate, it was deeply offensive. A final public betrayal. Shortly after, Philip submitted an obituary to the Toronto Star. In it, he described Anna as his beloved wife and best friend, adding that they had eagerly awaited the birth of their child. He concluded the notice by saying that their baby had joined her in heaven. But for those who had seen his actions, the words felt hollow. They didn't see a grieving husband. They saw a man performing a role. In the months that followed, Philip's relationship with his mistress quietly continued. Though the affair eventually appeared to end in early 2012, suspicions had taken root in the community. Rumors about Philip's behavior multiplied. Friends whispered. Former congregants gossiped. And yet, there was growing frustration. How could so much evidence exist and still no charges? Behind the scenes, however, law enforcement had not been idle. Homicide detectives had quietly opened an investigation. They were gathering medical records, analyzing digital communications, interviewing witnesses. Every week brought new pieces to the puzzle. And as their file grew, so did the realization that this was no accident, no tragic twist of fate. They were slowly, methodically building a case. After months of quiet investigation, behind closed doors and away from public scrutiny, the truth that detectives had been quietly piecing together finally came into sharp focus. Through careful collection of digital evidence, medical records, witness testimony, and expert analysis, the conclusion that law enforcement reached was chilling in its clarity. Philip Grandine had not only betrayed his vows he had planned, over time and with great intention, to end the life of his pregnant wife, Anna. According to the investigative team, this wasn't a crime born of impulse or emotional volatility. It had the hallmarks of deliberation, a slow, calculated series of actions leading up to a singular moment of irreversible consequence. And so, in May of 2012, nearly 7 months after Anna's tragic passing, authorities took action. Philip Grandine was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder, a charge that carried the full weight of premeditated intent under Canadian law. It was a development that marked a turning point in the case and sent a powerful message. Anna's death would not be treated as just another domestic tragedy. It would be investigated for what it truly was, a carefully executed act. In a statement issued by the Ontario Homicide Division, a spokesperson explained that no single piece of evidence alone secured the arrest. Instead, it was the accumulated force of many small but powerful details. Details that, when woven together, formed a damning tapestry. The case, they said, was a matter of patiently following each thread until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Despite the seriousness of the charges, Philip was not placed in a traditional detention center while awaiting trial. In a controversial ruling, the presiding judge permitted him to remain under house arrest at his parents' rural farm property in Brant County. Their home, nestled far from urban centers, was shielded from the public eye, and their identities were kept confidential due to concerns about safety and media intrusion. But the news of Philip's arrest could not be contained. As it spread, it sent shockwaves through the community. The tight-knit circles that once viewed the Grandine as a model couple were left stunned. For many, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Neighbors who had shared meals, holidays, and summer afternoons with Philip and Anna found themselves grappling with disbelief. One neighbor, a woman named Linda, offered her own reflection in a local interview. She remembered warm evenings on the porch with the couple, celebrating birthdays with homemade cake and lemonade. In her words, Philip always seemed gentle, quiet, sometimes nervous, especially when talking about the baby, but never angry or distant. Nothing, she said, gave the impression that such darkness could have been hiding behind his smile. But investigators saw a different picture. They believed that Philip had not only betrayed his wife through infidelity and deception, but had methodically orchestrated her death, using both his medical knowledge and access to pharmaceuticals to exploit Anna's trust and vulnerability. The road to justice, however, would not be swift. It would take nearly 2 years of legal preparation before the case reached a courtroom. In 2014, the highly anticipated murder trial finally began. A proceeding that would unearth painful truths, expose long-hidden secrets, and reveal the depth of planning behind Anna's tragic end. Prosecutors laid out a harrowing narrative. Philip Grandine, once a respected pastor and trusted nurse, had used his position, education, and privilege to carry out a deadly plan. They argued that he had sedated his wife and waited for her to become defenseless. The motivation, they alleged, was not simply emotional strain, but a calculated desire to liberate himself from the obligations of marriage and parenthood, so he could pursue a future with the woman with whom he had maintained a secret affair. As the trial unfolded, the identity of this woman was confirmed in court. She was not a stranger to the family. In fact, she had once been the couple's nanny, a caregiver, and a church member who had shared their home and their faith. The betrayal, for those who knew Anna, now cut even deeper. Philip entered a plea of not guilty, maintaining that Anna's death had either been a terrible accident or, more disturbingly, an act she had committed herself. But the prosecution had prepared a meticulous case, and they came armed with evidence that told a very different story. One of the key witnesses was Dr. Irving Gora, Anna's family physician of nearly 10 years. On the stand, Dr. Gora made it clear he had never prescribed the drug found in Anna's system during both her hospitalization and her post-mortem exam. She had no history of needing such a medication, he testified. It would never have been appropriate, especially given her condition. Dr. Gora added another crucial detail. Shortly before Anna's death, Philip had visited him, citing depression and marital tension. During that appointment, Philip confided his doubts about Anna, stating that he questioned whether she had ever been the right person for him. This conversation painted a picture of a man emotionally checked out, quietly searching for an exit. Anna's obstetrician, who had overseen her prenatal care, echoed Dr. Gora's testimony. He also confirmed that no such sedative had been prescribed to Anna during her pregnancy. His medical records were clear, complete, and consistent. Then came the toxicology reports, evidence that would serve as a linchpin in the case. Analysts revealed that traces of the sedative were present in 2 separate instances. First, on October 14th, when Anna was hospitalized with dizziness and confusion. At the time, the levels were low. But by October 17th, the day she died, the concentration of the drug had significantly increased. This suggested something deeply sinister. Anna had been drugged not once, but twice. The The first incident appeared to be a test run. The second was fatal. Perhaps the most haunting revelation came from a forensic dive into Philip's computer usage. Investigators had obtained his hard drive and found troubling searches made from his user account. On October 10th, just 1 week before Anna's death, someone had typed into a search engine, "Is 100 milligrams fatal?" Prosecutors presented this as undeniable evidence of premeditation. They argued that the hospital visit on October 14th wasn't a surprise. It was an experiment, a trial run, a practice attempt to gauge dosage and timing. And just 3 days later, with the stakes raised and the dosage increased, Anna was gone. But that wasn't all. Digital activity records also revealed that while Anna was still recovering in the hospital on the morning of October 14th, someone logged into Philip's user account at 4:48 a.m. and searched for nightlife venues and clubs in Toronto. Hours later, while Anna was preparing to return home, that same user account accessed multiple adult websites. These actions painted a stark picture. While his wife was hospitalized, confused, and vulnerable, Philip appeared to be focused on personal gratification and future planning, not care or concern. And once Anna returned home, that user account was active again. Another search about the sedative appeared, further suggesting ongoing intent. One of the most damning testimonies came from Catherine Fior, a former supervisor at the retirement home where Philip had worked. She explained that as an associate head nurse, Philip was responsible for managing medication, both dispensing and discarding prescriptions for elderly residents. Investigators later found a digital document on his personal computer, dated June 20th, 11, listing the names of residents and their prescribed medications. Among them, the very sedative found in Anna. This document tied everything together. He had access, he had knowledge, and he had motive. As the courtroom lights dimmed and the final weeks of testimony approached, one final revelation came to light, one that would further dismantle the already crumbling foundation of Philip Grandine's defense. Technology experts, called in by the prosecution, revealed a digital footprint that directly contradicted Philip's account of his whereabouts on the morning of Anna's death. He had insisted under oath that he had been out jogging, a routine he supposedly kept to manage stress. But forensic specialists found otherwise. They discovered that, on the very day Anna was found unresponsive in the bathtub, the adult content filters on Philip's personal computer had been disabled. This seemingly small discovery was a bombshell. To the jury, it pointed to a disturbing truth. Philip may have never left the house at all that morning. If his claim about jogging was false, what else had he misled investigators about? The implication was clear. The timeline he had provided was manipulated, designed to create distance between himself and Anna's final moments. What was once viewed as a lapse in memory now looked more like deliberate deception. And then came testimony that stripped away the last remaining layers of doubt. Philip's former mistress, once the couple's nanny and a familiar face within their church, was called to the stand. Her demeanor was cautious, her tone neutral. She told the court that she and Philip had spoken on the phone for 30 uninterrupted minutes, on the very day he claimed to have discovered his wife in distress. She described him as composed and unemotional. He never mentioned Anna's condition, never expressed fear or panic. There was no hint that something horrific had taken place in his home just hours earlier. Later that same day, following his release from police questioning, Philip arrived at her home. According to her account, he was quiet but not shaken, reserved but not grieving. When asked if he had said anything about what had happened, she claimed no. He never described any specific event, never used words like accident or emergency. Instead, his behavior suggested detachment, even indifference. Despite their romantic history, she said they had remained just friends at that point. But her version of events painted a picture very different from the one Philip had tried to present in court. A grieving, heartbroken husband devastated by sudden tragedy. His attorneys attempted to regain control of the narrative. They introduced an alternate theory, that Anna had consumed the sedative herself, possibly out of despair upon learning of the affair. They described her as emotionally overwhelmed, isolated, and confused. Their suggestion, carefully framed, was that Anna's death was the result of her own tragic decision, not Philip's actions. But the mountain of circumstantial evidence standing against him could not be ignored. From his access to the medication, to the suspicious computer searches, to the pattern of behavior leading up to Anna's death, The picture the prosecution had painted was one of escalating recklessness, profound dishonesty, and lethal negligence. And so, in January 2015, after just 2 days of jury deliberation, the court reached its verdict. Philip Grandine was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, a conviction that, while falling short of first-degree murder, still carried the gravity of intentional wrongdoing. During the sentencing phase, the judge offered a pointed assessment. They spoke of Philip's systematic deception, the manipulation of trust, and the emotional devastation left in his wake. The level of cruelty exhibited in this case defies understanding, the judge said. A 15-year prison sentence was handed down. Outside the courthouse, Anna's mother and sister addressed the media. Standing with quiet strength, they spoke not of revenge, but of remembrance. Anna was light, her mother said. She loved without limit. She forgave when others would not. And she deserved so much more. Through tears, they thanked the community for its support and prayers. But peace remained elusive. Not long after sentencing, Philip filed an appeal, challenging the verdict. In a controversial decision, an appellate court found that a technical error, specifically how the jury had been instructed, may have influenced the outcome. The conviction was overturned. A new trial was ordered, and once again, Philip was released on bail. The second trial began in early 2019, more than 7 years after Anna's death. The new charges reflected a downgraded accusation: involuntary manslaughter. Prosecutors, while disappointed by the reversal, were determined to pursue justice under the revised terms. This time, they argued that even if Philip had not acted with the clear-cut intent to kill, he had behaved with gross and criminal negligence. By administering or enabling the consumption of a powerful sedative, knowing full well the medical risks, it was his actions that had led to Anna's death. They further asserted that Philip's motive remained unchanged. The defense repeated its prior claims, that Anna's death was a tragic accident, possibly even self-inflicted. They pointed to the lack of direct witnesses and asserted that the prosecution could not definitively prove Philip had given Anna the drug himself. But the jury, now armed with years of hindsight, detailed evidence, and emotional testimony, delivered their decision. Philip was found guilty once more, this time of involuntary manslaughter. Though the charge was lesser, the impact on Anna's family was not. Philip remained free on bail as he awaited sentencing. During the impact statements, Anna's mother stood in court again. Her voice cracked as she described the long, painful journey her family had endured. Losing a child, she said, is like losing the sun, and knowing someone helped dim that light, intentionally or not, is a pain that never ends. Anna's father, who had traveled from the Philippines to attend the trial, spoke through an interpreter. He recounted how, on the flight to Canada for his daughter's funeral, he suffered 2 strokes, a direct result, he believed, of the grief that had overwhelmed him. Doctors later confirmed the stress had pushed his body to its limit. "I lost more than a daughter," he said. "I lost part of myself." In early 2020, Philip was sentenced again to 15 years in prison. But even then, the case refused to end. Philip filed yet another appeal. And shockingly, he was once again granted bail, a decision that further disheartened Anna's already weary family. His legal team argued that there was no indisputable evidence proving he had administered the drug himself, or that he had predicted it would lead to Anna's death. They also called the 15-year sentence disproportionate. By now, the family's hope for resolution had begun to erode. Every appeal, every delay, every conditional release felt like a denial of justice. "The man who promised to protect her," Anna's sister said in an interview, "is the one who destroyed her. And yet, we keep watching him walk free." Then, at long last, in May 2022, more than 10 years after Anna's passing, the legal process reached its final conclusion. Philip Grandine was at last ordered to begin serving the full 15-year sentence, with no further chance of release or appeal. On October 26th, in the vicinity of an abandoned house located on East Main Street, a building known among locals as a hangout spot for teenagers during the evenings, a passerby reported noticing a foul odor and observed that the basement door was left ajar. Curious and concerned, the individual descended into the basement where they encountered a chilling scene. The space was filled with the scent of damp concrete and old furniture, and in the corner of the room, lying motionless on her side, was the body of a young woman. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Upon arrival, authorities confirmed that the woman showed no signs of life. She was later identified as Katie Blauvelt. After examining the scene, law enforcement officials were quick to conclude that this was neither an accident nor a case of theft gone wrong. The evidence pointed to something far more sinister. Police stated firmly, this was a deliberate and calculated murder. Every crime has its own story, and we're here to tell it to you, our dear viewers. Like, comment, and subscribe. Stay with us. Catherine Elizabeth Blauvelt, more affectionately known as Katie to those who were fortunate enough to truly know her, was born in the peaceful heart of South Carolina in the year 1994. From an early age, those closest to her recognized a rare light in her character. Family members and childhood friends consistently described Katie as a beacon of warmth and compassion, someone who possessed not only a quiet charm, but also a seemingly endless well of kindness. Her presence was often likened to a calming breeze, subtle yet unforgettable. Katie's early years unfolded in the close-knit town of Simpsonville, a small, welcoming community where neighbors waved from porches and children rode bicycles down sun-drenched streets. Simpsonville was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and helped each other without asking. It was in this serene environment that Katie's values were shaped. Her family, deeply rooted in faith and tradition, embodied what many would call the definition of decency. Her parents, devoted members of their church and respected by all who knew them, instilled in Katie the importance of humility, kindness, and service to others. From them, she inherited not only a spiritual foundation, but also an unshakable inner strength that would later define her most trying moments. As Katie matured, her nature remained steadfast. She was neither boastful nor attention-seeking, yet she stood out effortlessly in every setting she entered. At school, Katie was known for her friendliness and her ability to connect with nearly everyone. Classmates, teachers, even the more reserved students who often kept to themselves. She wasn't interested in being the center of attention, yet her kindness made her magnetic. She participated enthusiastically in church activities, community outreach, and volunteer programs, earning the respect and admiration of both peers and adults. Katie's dream had always been to work with children, particularly those who faced personal or academic struggles. She felt called to be a teacher, not for prestige, but to make a real and lasting difference. After completing her studies in education, she returned to her hometown to begin her career. She was hired as a teacher's assistant at a local school, where her patience and empathy quickly earned her a special place in the hearts of students and staff alike. Whether she was staying after class to tutor a struggling child, or offering a listening ear to a student going through a hard time at home, Katie never failed to give her best. It was during her high school years that Katie met John Blauvelt, a young man who stood in contrast to her soft-spoken, thoughtful demeanor. John, who was a few years older, had already enlisted in the Army and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen more of the world than most teenagers. He was charismatic in a way that made people listen, and to Katie, he appeared as someone grounded, someone who could offer the safety and stability she valued. Their connection was swift and intense. Friends of Katie recall how deeply she fell for John, noting how she seemed captivated by his strength and decisiveness. In those early days, he appeared attentive, protective, and determined. Katie, ever idealistic and hopeful, believed she had found someone who truly understood her. Their relationship continued even after John was stationed away. They maintained long-distance contact, sharing letters, calls, and dreams of a future together. That future materialized a few years later when they got married in a modest but joy-filled ceremony. Katie, glowing in her wedding dress, looked genuinely happy. John, more reserved by nature, appeared composed, yet quietly supportive. The photos from that day still reflect a sense of hope and beginning. In the months following their wedding, the couple seemed to be settling into a typical life together. They rented a small house in town, where Katie continued working at the school, and John, when not on military assignment, took on household responsibilities. From the outside, their life may have seemed simple, even idyllic, a young couple building a life, anchored in shared goals and quiet devotion. But as time went on, subtle changes began to appear, the kind of changes that are easy to dismiss at first, but impossible to ignore as they accumulate. Katie, once a regular at church gatherings, social events, and family dinners, started to become less visible. Friends noticed that she would decline invitations more often or cancel at the last minute, offering vague reasons about being busy or tired. She began to seem preoccupied, even anxious. Her once bright and open demeanor took on a reserved quality. She smiled less, spoke in shorter sentences, and avoided conversations about her personal life. It wasn't like her and her loved ones knew it. Over time, a clearer picture began to emerge. Although Katie rarely confided in detail, small hints began to surface. She would mention arguments at home or frustrations that seemed out of proportion to their causes. She stopped talking about John in affectionate terms. Instead, her comments about him were neutral or hesitant. Concerned friends and family began to suspect that not all was well in the Blauvelt household. Eventually, it became evident that the marriage was far from the harmonious relationship it once seemed to be. Those closest to Katie began to understand that John's behavior had shifted. He had become controlling, critical, and increasingly unpredictable. He questioned who Katie spoke to, expressed dissatisfaction with her job, and even discouraged her from participating in church events that once brought her peace. His actions, while not always overtly dramatic, created an atmosphere of isolation. Slowly but surely, he was cutting Katie off from her support system. To those who knew her, Katie's silence spoke volumes. She had always been someone who faced challenges with quiet grace, rarely burdening others with her troubles. So when she said that things will work out, or that the tension was just a rough patch, her loved ones wanted to believe her, even as their instincts told them otherwise. A typical reaction of a woman who found herself in a relationship with an emotionally or physically dangerous partner. In the year 2016, Catherine Elizabeth Blauvelt, known to everyone as Katie, took a courageous and life-altering step. She initiated the process of ending her marriage. For those closest to her, the decision was long in the making, though no less difficult for her to carry out. Despite the unmistakable signs of an emotionally strained and increasingly controlling relationship, Katie had held on for years to the hope that things might somehow improve. She had invested emotionally, spiritually, and practically in the marriage. But by that year, she could no longer ignore the toll it was taking on her well-being. Katie's decision to file for divorce was neither impulsive nor reactionary. It came after months, perhaps years, of internal struggle, prayers, and weighing the consequences. Leaving someone she had once trusted, especially someone as commanding as John, was never going to be easy. Still, she found the strength within herself to act, motivated by a need for personal safety, mental clarity, and a life of dignity that she knew she deserved. But, as tragically happens in many such cases, the point of separation did not bring peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a darker chapter. For Katie, the weeks that followed her legal move to divorce John became a time of great uncertainty and emotional strain. John did not take the news well. Friends and family would later recount how he refused to accept the end of the relationship. Despite her clear intentions, he tried repeatedly to regain control over her decisions and her life. He appeared without warning at places he knew she would be. He sent messages, some pleading, others agitated. He called frequently, often late at night. And though Katie was shaken by these behaviors, she remained steadfast. She moved out and began living separately, choosing a modest apartment that gave her a sense of personal space and freedom. At work, she maintained a professional composure. She showed up on time, carried out her duties as a teacher's assistant with the same gentleness and dedication that had always defined her. Though slightly more reserved in conversations with colleagues, she still smiled at students and shared kind words with staff. Her attempt to return to normalcy, to establish a new routine, was quiet but determined. October 24th, 2016 was a cloudy and unremarkable Monday for the residents of Simpsonville, a small town in South Carolina where life flows slowly and measuredly. For Katie Blauvelt, this day began as a normal workday. She left the house and went to school, where she helped teach elementary grades. According to coworkers, Katie arrived at school on time and fulfilled her duties with her usual professionalism. She was polite, composed, though perhaps a little more inward-looking than usual. She didn't mention anything unusual, nor did she hint at any plans for the evening. Her reserved demeanor didn't immediately raise concern. After all, she had a lot on her mind. But what happened afterward remains an open question that has haunted her family and community ever since. That afternoon, something changed. Katie stopped responding to phone calls. She didn't reply to text messages. She never returned home. Initially, her family assumed the delay was due to a dead phone battery or unexpected fatigue. She often poured herself into her work and sometimes rested when she returned home. But as time ticked into evening hours, worry began to set in. It was unlike Katie not to notify someone if her plans changed. She was known for her punctuality and reliability. By late that evening, her parents, increasingly distressed, contacted local authorities to report their daughter missing. The police responded quickly, considering that this was an adult, but extremely responsible young woman who had never disappeared without warning before. The next day, the police began searching. First, they checked Katie's house. Everything was in place. No signs of a break-in were found. The phone was silent. The car could not be found either. As the hours passed, it became clear. This was not an accidental disappearance. With each hour, the likelihood of bad news grew higher. The car also could not be found near the school or at her friends. First, they checked hospitals, then traffic accidents, but none of the databases yielded results. Friends began spreading information on social networks, hoping that someone had seen her after work. By nightfall, the search was expanded. They checked the nearest bus stops, shopping centers, cafes where she sometimes went. The parents hardly slept. They drove around the city, peered into the windows of their car in the hope of noticing a familiar silhouette. Meanwhile, school colleagues also joined the search. Some suggested checking the area around her school, others her old walking routes. Students wrote messages of support and asked how they could help. The morning of October 25th arrived, and Katie was still missing. By midday, her photo with the short caption "missing" had circulated on local news sites and social media groups. Her parents posted a video appealing for any information and asking Katie, if she saw this, to just let them know. One of her friends printed out dozens of flyers and began posting them at gas stations, grocery stores, and schools. Volunteers gathered at a makeshift headquarters in the parish church where Katie had previously helped with children's events. They set up a hotline and a table with a map of the city, marking possible directions she might have taken. Every hour brought more anxiety, but there was still hope. Everyone tried to think positively, believing that she was simply stuck somewhere, had turned off her phone, or was going through something she wasn't ready to talk about yet. By the evening of the second day, anxiety was everywhere in the city. Almost everyone who followed the local news even a little knew about her disappearance. In the stores where Katie often went, the salespeople immediately recognized her in the photos and asked if she had been found. One of the cafes where she went on weekends even hung a leaflet in the window with the words, "We are waiting for you, Katie." The police began checking the surveillance cameras along the main roads leading from the school to her house. Some neighbors recalled seeing her car in the evening, but no one could say exactly when. The police questioned everyone who had been in contact with her in recent days: friends, colleagues, parents, parishioners from her church. No one reported anything unusual. On the contrary, everyone emphasized how calm and focused she seemed on everyday affairs. Journalists began to take an interest in the case, and soon Katie's name appeared in regional news broadcasts. One of the stories showed an interview with her mother, who spoke in a trembling voice about her daughter and asked those who could see her to respond. Volunteers with badges and stacks of leaflets began to appear on the streets, which they handed out to passers-by. Posts with calls were distributed on social networks. Please share. Every repost can help. People who did not know her personally wrote words of support and expressed their willingness to help in the search. A prayer meeting was held in the church. The hall was full. The priest spoke about hope, about how important it is not to lose faith in difficult times. On the third day of the search, members of the volunteer group combed the forest belt outside the city. Katie loved to walk in nature, and some thought that she might have simply gone off to think. The police turned to drone owners for help, and aerial searches of hard-to-reach areas began. The parents hardly left the house, waiting for a call or a knock on the door that would bring at least some news. The hotline rang around the clock, but so far there was not a single confirmed lead. The silence was becoming heavier. People tried not to say their worst thoughts out loud, hoping that everything would end well. But there was already a feeling in the air. Something had gone wrong. On October 26th, in the area of the abandoned house on East Main Street, an abandoned building where teenagers sometimes gathered in the evenings, a passerby noticed a strange smell and an open door to the basement. Going down, he found a concrete floor, old furniture, and of a young woman. She was lying on her side, showing no signs of life. Emergency services were immediately called. At the scene, the police found Katie Blauvelt. The police immediately stated, "This was not an accident, not a robbery. This was a murder committed with cold calculation." Moreover, the nature of the wounds and the overall picture made it clear. The killer knew the victim, acted with hatred, and possibly planned the crime in advance. The place where Katie was found was carefully cordoned off. Forensic experts worked until late at night, recording every detail: shoe prints, microfibers on the concrete floor, remnants of biological materials. There was no light in the basement where she was found, only an old fluorescent lamp, scraps of insulation on the walls, and moldy boards. Investigators noted that the killer was most likely well acquainted with this place. He knew how to get there and how to hide his tracks. Katie's car was soon found in another part of the city, carefully parked with no signs of a struggle. The equipment was immediately sent for examination. Fingerprints, some partially erased, were found on the steering wheel, door handle, and gear lever. Tiny DNA stains, hair, and, most importantly, a shoe print matching the one later found in the basement were found in the car. This gave the police their key lead. The police also soon found their first serious piece of evidence: a video recording from a CCTV camera at a nearby store. The recording showed a man matching John Blauvelt's description next to Katie's car. The recording was made just a few hours before the body was discovered. When the police tried to find John, they found that he had disappeared. Moreover, he was not the only one missing. Along with him, 18-year-old Hannah Thompson, with whom John was reportedly in a romantic relationship despite their age difference, had disappeared. Her family reported her missing almost simultaneously with the start of the search for John. The people of Simpsonville were shocked. A man who worked with teenagers, who regularly visited schools, was involved in a heinous crime. This did not fit into the usual picture of life in a quiet southern town. While the country followed the news, the authorities increased their efforts. Federal warrants were issued. John was added to the wanted list of the U.S. Marshals Service, and the search covered several states. Now the situation took on an even more alarming tone. Police and federal agencies began a nationwide search. John Blauvelt became not just a suspect. He was charged with premeditated murder, illegal possession and use of weapons, and was also recognized as a deserter from the U.S. Army, since he left military service without permission, without notifying the command. Following the discovery of Catherine Blauvelt and the disappearance of John Blauvelt, along with minor Hannah Thompson, the investigation came under the control of not only local authorities, but also federal agencies. Over the first few days, the South Carolina State Police, the FBI, and the U.S. Marshals Service began a coordinated effort to establish the suspect's escape route. It was confirmed that John had withdrawn cash from a bank account the day before his disappearance and had also turned off his cell phone, indicating a deliberate attempt to evade surveillance. Investigators searched John's home, rental car, and a motel where he had apparently stayed a few days before the murder. Items belonging to Katie were found there, as well as scraps of maps, lists of gas stations, and potential routes. The evidence indicated that the crime had been premeditated. In addition, John's phone, which was recovered through digital forensics, contained threatening messages to Katie, as well as disturbing messages sent to Hannah, in which he promised to go far away and start over. Meanwhile, Hannah Thompson's disappearance also caused a wide resonance. Her photo appeared in the National Database of Missing Persons, and emergency meetings with parents and students were held in schools in the region. It was soon confirmed that Hannah had not been kidnapped. She left with John of her own free will, but due to her age, she was considered a victim of illegal movement of a minor, which only worsened Blauvelt's legal situation. Information about Blauvelt was spread throughout the country. He was put on the federal wanted list, assigned the status of especially dangerous. Posters with his photo, in military uniform and without, appeared in post offices, gas stations, stores. Law enforcement agencies warned he could be armed and extremely dangerous. It is known that he had high physical fitness, good survival skills, and, importantly, experience in evading surveillance, acquired during his military service. The investigation reached a dead end for several months. The tracks of John and Hannah were lost somewhere between Georgia and Arkansas. Every now and then, there were reports from eyewitnesses. Someone allegedly saw a man similar to him in a grocery store. Someone claimed to have seen a couple in a trailer park. However, none of the versions were confirmed. Blauvelt remained a ghost on the roads of America, as if he had disappeared. Hannah did not contact her family during this period, and her whereabouts remained unknown, which caused doubly alarm, both about her safety and about whether she could have been an unwitting accomplice or witness. Katie's family did not stop fighting all this time. Her parents actively interacted with journalists, created social media pages to maintain interest in the case, published memories of Katie so that she would not become a faceless victim of statistics. The city held memorial events and marches calling for justice and the speedy capture of the criminal. Simpsonville became a place of shared grief and anxiety, where everyone felt that evil was closer than anyone could have imagined. For 6 long years, John Blauvelt's name remained in the federal database of wanted criminals. His face, sometimes in an army uniform, sometimes in civilian photos, appeared on the websites of human rights organizations, in programs about fugitives, on digital billboards along southern highways. But time passed, and the flow of information about him became less and less frequent, and the searches became more and more routine. The investigation did not stop, but it went on in the background, as if the world was slowly beginning to forget. And yet, someone did not forget. In the summer of 2022, a middle-aged man in Medford, Oregon, walked into a small dental clinic complaining of a toothache. He introduced himself as Benjamin Wallace, filled out a form, provided an address, and a social security number. The dentist didn't suspect anything out of the ordinary, but the clinic administrator noticed that the man was withdrawn, avoided eye contact, and, most importantly, there was no social security number in the patient database. She contacted the local police, as is required by protocol when dealing with false information. This became the first seed in the chain of a future arrest. A few days later, Medford police ran a random background check on Wallace. They sent a request to the federal database and received an alarming match in photo recognition. The man who was getting dental work was 96% similar in appearance to John Blauvelt, an Army deserter and murder suspect who has been on the run since 2016. The automatic face matching system found a match not only in the eyes and chin shape, but also in the location of the moles and the scar under the left ear. A special surveillance team began external surveillance. The man lived in a trailer on the outskirts of the city, got a job at an auto repair shop, and received cash. Neighbors described him as polite but aloof. No one knew where he was from, and he himself did not say. At work, they called him simply Ben. He did not use social networks, paid only in cash, and left no digital traces. All this only increased suspicion. Soon, the investigation received a warrant to covertly take fingerprints from objects he touched, cans, tools left in the workshop. The prints were compared with those left in Katie Blauvelt's car. The match was unambiguous. Then the U.S. Marshals, together with the local police, decided to act. On the morning of July 12, 2022, at 5:47 a.m. local time, U.S. Marshals surrounded the mobile home where John lived. The operation was carried out with lightning speed. No sirens, no noise. One of the officers would later say, "He didn't even resist. He just opened the door, looked at us, and looked down. He knew it was over." He had fake documents, some cash, a knife in a backpack, and a cheap push-button phone without a SIM card. He was calm, almost apathetic, and didn't even ask who turned him in. After questioning at the station, it became clear. All this time, he had been living under other people's names, moving between small towns, never staying anywhere for more than a few months. He spent the night in cars, in campgrounds, at construction sites, sometimes asking to go to private farmers' barns for food and work. He didn't use the internet, didn't call anyone, not even relatives. His trail finally went cold back in 2017, and only the intuition of one woman who noticed inconsistencies led to his exposure. But when John Hanna was arrested, Hanna was not with him. Their escape lasted several months. According to Hanna herself, later told to the investigation, they often spent the night in cars, ate cheap food, worked odd jobs. But John increasingly showed cruelty, not physical, but emotional. He became cold, suspicious, controlling. He forbade her to call home, to go out alone, checked her phone. He instilled fear in her. He said that if she left, she would be an accomplice, that she would be imprisoned, that no one would believe. Hanna began to understand that she had become a hostage. About 4 months after the escape, she finally decided to escape. After leaving Blauvelt, she hitchhiked to another part of the state, then contacted a distant relative who drove her home. Her family kept the details of her return secret. There was too much publicity, and they wanted to protect her from the press. She spent several months in isolation, undergoing therapy and not commenting. But 2 years later, secretly from the public, she finally agreed to cooperate with the investigation. It was Hanna who provided the critical testimony that later became part of the case. She described how John planned the escape, how he changed documents, how he talked about an area where no one would find us. She described his behavior in the days after Katie's disappearance. He was agitated, silent, sometimes panicked. Hanna said she feared for her life, but for a long time she did not understand what was really happening. Only later, after therapy, did she begin to understand the scale of the psychological pressure she was under. The investigation did not bring charges against her. She was a minor, deceived by an adult man who manipulated her trust. Psychologists who worked with her confirmed Hanna was not an accomplice. She was a victim. After his arrest, Blauvelt was transported back to South Carolina, where he was formally charged with a number of serious offenses, including first-degree murder, illegal possession of a weapon, desertion, and charges related to the illegal movement of a minor. He was awaiting the trial that Katie's family had long sought. New data analysis methods, including behavioral pattern matching technology and the use of facial recognition databases, played a key role in his capture. One of the algorithms used in law enforcement agencies noted a match between a photograph of a suspect and a random facial scan from the local ORDMV database. This match became the starting point that led to his capture. Blauvelt's arrest was something of a moral victory for Kathy's family. Her mother said publicly, "We've waited 6 long years for this day. Justice is still to come, but at least now we know he will never hurt anyone again." Simpsonville held a memorial service for Kathy, free of anxiety and fear now that the killer was behind bars. The city could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The trial of John Tufton Blauvelt began in the spring of 2023 in Greenville County, South Carolina. The case had gained publicity over the years, and the opening session was packed with reporters, federal officials, civil rights activists, and dozens of Simpsonville residents who had followed the story from the beginning. Despite the attention, however, the trial was not theatrical. Prosecutors focused on a clear, methodical presentation of the facts to ensure that the defense had no reason to doubt the validity of the charges. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence: surveillance footage, threatening messages, biological traces found in a rental car, and accounts from employees of motels where Blauvelt stayed in the days leading up to the murder. One of the key pieces of evidence was the testimony of Hannah Thompson, who was 23 at the time of the trial. She personally confirmed that John not only planned the escape in advance, but also repeatedly said that Katie had ruined his life and had to answer for it. These words, recorded in her testimony, became the central argument of the prosecution in proving the premeditation of the crime. Blauvelt's defense tried to use classic tactics, questioning the mental state of the accused, talking about the pressures of military service, emotional instability, stress after the breakup of the marriage. However, the court did not accept arguments about temporary insanity. The hearing lasted for several weeks. Every day, Katie's parents were in the courtroom, and every day they silently watched as a chain of evidence was built against the man who took their daughter from them. When John first looked at them in the courtroom, Katie's mother didn't look away. She simply held the photograph of her daughter in her hands and didn't flinch. May 31st, 2023. The jury returned after 8 hours of deliberation. People held their breath as the foreman entered the room. The judge asked everyone to stand. The piece of paper in the juror's hand trembled slightly. There was no tremor in his voice, however. On the charge of first-degree murder, found guilty. On the charge of unlawful possession of a weapon during the commission of a felony, found guilty. A heavy but cleansing silence fell over the courtroom. Someone in the back sobbed. John Blauvelt's expression did not change. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and lowered his head. The judge asked the parties to remain seated and immediately began to read the sentence. In view of the gravity of the crime, the circumstances, and the lack of remorse on the part of the defendant, the court imposes a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Pause. Additionally, 25 years for the related charge. The sentences are to be served consecutively. An appeal does not stay the execution. The judge's words sounded like formalities, but for Katie's parents, it was the end of a long, painful chapter. Her mother lowered her head and cried, the first time she had done so openly in the entire trial. Her father put his hand on her shoulder. There was no relief on their faces. No, there was exhaustion and silence. The same silence that comes after a storm when everything has been destroyed. But finally, you don't have to hold on with all you might. As the guard stood behind Blauvelt, he looked out into the courtroom one last time. No one looked back, not a single glance. He walked out with his head down and never looked back. Later, already at the exit, the prosecutor would say into the microphones, "We can't bring Katie back, but today is the day of justice. Today she won." It was already late in the morning when John returned to the house. As he stepped out of his car and approached the front steps, a strange feeling gripped him. Something felt off. A subtle chill ran down his spine. He paused briefly, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the house was unnaturally quiet. There was no sound of Susan in the kitchen, no clatter of dishes, no gentle hum of morning activity. He moved cautiously from room to room, his concern growing with every unanswered call of her name. As he reached the master bedroom, dread pooled in his chest. He turned the corner into the bathroom and stopped cold. What he saw there would haunt him forever. Susan was lying motionless. Her condition, as John later described with a trembling voice during the 911 call, was critical. His voice broke as he tried to explain what had happened, struggling to hold himself together long enough to give the dispatcher the information they needed. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but what they found inside the house was not just tragic. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us. In the heart of Oklahoma City, amid its quiet suburbs and bustling hospitals, a story began that would first inspire admiration and later stir widespread disbelief and sorrow. It was the year 1985, a time of big hair, synthesizer music, and traditional family values still deeply rooted in the American Midwest. In a modest yet cozy apartment not far from downtown lived Susan, a devoted single mother raising her child with steadfast commitment and grace. She worked as a nurse, a profession that reflected not only her skills and dedication, but also her deeply held values as a devout Christian. Those who knew Susan described her as the embodiment of warmth and compassion, gentle in her demeanor, but resolute in character. She lived her life anchored in faith, humility, and service to others, often going beyond the call of duty for her patients, her church, and her small circle of close friends. That same year, at a continuing education seminar for medical professionals, fate intervened. It was there that Susan first met Dr. John Hamilton, a man who seemed to possess everything one might hope for in a life partner. A well-known obstetrician and gynecologist, John had already built a successful career. Colleagues and patients alike held him in high regard. He was charismatic without being overbearing, confident without arrogance, and meticulous in both his surgical technique and his bedside manner. He was also a father from a previous marriage, balancing the pressures of parenthood and a demanding medical practice with notable ease. The chemistry between Susan and John was palpable from the very beginning. Their initial conversation, centered on healthcare, ethics, and the challenges of balancing work and personal life, sparked something much deeper. John was captivated by Susan's sincerity, her unshakable moral compass, and the kindness she extended to everyone she encountered. Susan, in turn, found in John a man of strength, purpose, and rare emotional availability. Despite his long hours and high-stakes career, he made time for her, listened intently, and showed affection in small, thoughtful ways that made her feel valued. Over the next 2 years, their bond deepened, nurtured by shared beliefs and mutual respect. In 1987, they married in a ceremony that friends still recall as joyful and sincere. Their wedding, held in a modest but elegant church, was filled with music, prayer, and an air of optimism for the future. Afterward, they settled into a beautiful, spacious home nestled in one of Oklahoma City's most affluent neighborhoods, a reflection of John's thriving practice and their shared desire for stability. Susan left her nursing job to focus on their home, marriage, and community involvement. She quickly became a familiar figure in local charity events, church outreach programs, and neighborhood gatherings. Those close to her said she found purpose in uplifting others, mentoring young women in her church, and organizing donation drives for families in need. Meanwhile, John continued to build his reputation as a leading physician in women's health care, specializing in reproductive issues with a mix of professionalism and genuine care. To outsiders, the Hamiltons appeared to be a picture-perfect couple. Their life together seemed wrapped in a golden glow of romance, faith, and financial success. They were often seen attending charity galas, taking lavish trips to Europe and coastal resorts, or dining in upscale restaurants. John was known to spoil Susan with extravagant gifts: diamond earrings, luxury handbags, high-performance cars, including a sleek Porsche, and thoughtful handwritten letters tucked inside bouquets of her favorite lilies. His gestures weren't just for show. They reflected a man who, by all appearances, adored his wife deeply. And Susan, with her quiet smile and loyal heart, seemed equally smitten. Their marriage endured more than 15 years, years filled with laughter, meaningful conversations, and an unmistakable sense of togetherness. While they did not have children together, they appeared to embrace their role as a couple without regret. They poured their energy into each other, into building a home filled with love, stability, and purpose. But as time went on, subtle shifts began to take shape, cracks in the foundation that even those closest to them failed to detect. What started as a love story seemingly lifted from a fairy tale would, in due course, descend into a series of events both bewildering and devastating. Behind closed doors, beneath the surface of elegant parties and smiling holiday photos, tension quietly brewed. One of the growing complexities in their lives was John's professional involvement in a deeply polarizing area of medicine. Alongside delivering babies and providing reproductive care, John also performed certain procedures that, particularly in the conservative and religious climate of Oklahoma, stirred controversy. Though legal and medically supervised, his work made him the target of intense moral opposition from some activist groups. Protesters frequently assembled outside his clinic, displaying provocative signs and distributing emotionally charged pamphlets designed to provoke strong emotional responses. These demonstrations became a recurring spectacle, drawing attention from passers-by and local media. But their efforts weren't confined to the public square. They quickly escalated into deeply personal territory. These invasive tactics were meant to dissuade patients from returning, but more disturbingly, they were intended to spark social outrage, even retaliation. As tensions grew, that external hostility didn't stay on the clinic's doorstep. It eventually crossed the threshold of the Hamilton family home, seeping into their once peaceful domestic life. Susan Hamilton soon became an unwilling participant in this storm of animosity. Harassing phone calls began to pierce the quiet of their evenings. Calls that brought with them a series of unsettling messages, each filled with vague but deeply disturbing threats and cryptic insinuations. Some calls came from blocked numbers, their origins cloaked in anonymity. Though no single message was overtly actionable, the cumulative effect was chilling. It wasn't just paranoia. Friends close to Susan recalled her expressing genuine concern for her and John's safety on more than one occasion. Despite the unease that gnawed at her, Susan remained poised, anchored in loyalty. She rarely showed fear publicly, always presenting herself as composed and collected. As the devoted wife of a well-known physician, she stood by her husband without wavering, doing her best to maintain a facade of normalcy even as their private lives were being shaken from within. Together, Susan and John worked diligently to preserve the life they had built, a life defined by tradition, shared values, and mutual affection. Despite the storm that raged outside their doors, they continued to host their elegant dinner parties, where polished silverware and flickering candles created a refuge of civility. They remained active in their local church community, attending Sunday services with consistency, taking comfort in the familiar rhythm of worship. Holidays and anniversaries were marked with joy and ceremony, celebrated with the same kind of enthusiasm they had shown in the earliest years of their relationship. Among all their traditions, Valentine's Day held a uniquely sacred place in their hearts. Each year, like clockwork, they exchanged cards, personal, handwritten messages that brimmed with gratitude, fondness, and enduring love. These weren't generic gestures. They were testaments to a connection they had cultivated over decades. Neither Susan nor John ever seemed willing to forgo this tradition. It was a quiet ritual that symbolized continuity and stability, a shared belief in the strength of their bond, regardless of the challenges they faced. So, when February 14th, 2001 arrived, there was no public indication that anything was out of the ordinary. There was no sign, at least to the outside world, that anything had changed. That morning, in keeping with his routine, Dr. John Hamilton left their home early, around 7 a.m., to begin preparations for a surgical procedure at the hospital where he practiced. Dressed in comfortable street clothes, he reached the medical center by 8:40 a.m., then changed into hospital scrubs before entering the operating suite. Staff members at the hospital, familiar with his punctuality and calm demeanor, observed nothing unusual in his behavior. Everything appeared to be unfolding as it always had, with no visible indication of disturbance or distress. The morning's procedure went as planned, and once it was completed, John briefly returned home, a step that was, according to him, also routine. According to Dr. John Hamilton, that Valentine's morning had begun like any other in their well-appointed Oklahoma City home. Before heading back to the hospital for his next scheduled surgery, he claimed he left a bouquet of fresh-cut flowers and a romantic card for his wife Susan, gestures that had become a yearly tradition in their long marriage. He said she wasn't home when he returned from his earlier procedure. In his telling, the house was empty, still and quiet. So, after leaving the floral arrangement and heartfelt note in their usual spot, he departed again, unaware that within mere hours, his life and the lives of everyone around him would be changed irrevocably. But what awaited him on his next return would defy belief and shatter the illusion of everything that had once seemed so certain. It was late morning when John arrived back at the house. He immediately sensed something wasn't right. The front door was not just unlocked, it was partially open. For a neighborhood known for its privacy and safety, this was an alarming detail. A chill of uncertainty crept over him as he stepped inside. The house, usually filled with warmth and the subtle scent of candles Susan liked to light in the mornings, was unnaturally silent. No television buzzed in the background. No soft classical music hummed through the stereo system. There was no sign of Susan's presence. No clinking of dishes in the kitchen. No footsteps moving down the hall. Only a tense, unsettling stillness. As John moved cautiously through the home, calling his wife's name, he turned the corner into the master bathroom and froze. What he found, by his account, was devastating. Susan was lying on the floor, completely unresponsive. Her condition, as he described it in the 911 call made moments later, was dire. His voice cracked as he pleaded for assistance, barely holding it together. Paramedics arrived swiftly. But the scene that greeted them was more than tragic. It was deeply disturbing. The circumstances surrounding Susan's passing raised immediate questions. Medical personnel were trained to handle intense emergencies, but this one sent a jolt through even the most seasoned responders. The room spoke of more than loss. While authorities were careful with their language in public statements, privately, the working theory among the investigative team began to crystallize. This was not a random act. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It wasn't a medical episode. What they had walked into appeared to be the result of explosive targeted act. And the question hanging in the air: who could harbor such intense animosity towards someone like Susan Hamilton? She was universally admired, warm-hearted, deeply involved in her church, loyal to friends, and a woman known for her genuine kindness. The community was shaken. Whispers began to circulate, questions forming in the absence of answers. Something didn't add up. Detectives began documenting the scene. One of the first anomalies noted was the driveway. Both of the couple's cars were parked right outside. That detail immediately challenged John's claim that Susan hadn't been home earlier. Additionally, forensic analysis later revealed the presence of Susan's DNA inside John's vehicle, despite his statements about her whereabouts that morning. The inconsistencies kept adding up. John and Susan had always projected the image of an inseparable, deeply affectionate couple. To their friends, they were a team. Two people who, despite the pressures of John's demanding medical career, had created a home full of love and mutual admiration. But as the hours passed and evidence was analyzed, a different picture began to emerge. Behind the public display of unity, something had begun to unravel. That very evening, on Valentine's Day of all days, police made the difficult decision to arrest Dr. John Hamilton. He was taken into custody for questioning. The community watched in stunned disbelief. From the moment he was brought in, John's behavior drew attention. He appeared visibly distressed, shaking, rocking in his seat. Some officers in the room saw the shattered composure of a grieving husband. Others, however, were not so sure. There was something in his manner, an almost too frenzied desperation, that made some wonder if the grief was genuine or a mask for something else. Meanwhile, detectives had already ruled out one of the most common motives in such cases: burglary. Despite the front door being ajar, there were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. Expensive items, jewelry, designer handbags, valuable electronics, had all been left untouched. The home remained immaculate, aside from the area around the scene. But one thing was missing: a small marble figurine that typically sat on a shelf in the bathroom. It wasn't where it should have been. Despite a thorough search, the decorative statue was never found. Its disappearance raised unsettling possibilities. With no clear outside suspect and no sign of random criminal activity, detectives were forced to examine more intimate angles. Could Susan have been targeted for another reason? Could John's controversial medical work, specifically his involvement in abortion procedures, have brought danger to their doorstep? For years, John had been the subject of protest. Activists picketed outside his clinic. Some mailed angry letters. Others distributed flyers condemning his profession. Both he and Susan had faced vocal opposition. Police did consider the possibility that one of these critics might have escalated their hostility into something darker. Yet, as investigators poured through leads, they found no direct connection, no break-in, no evidence of outside entry, and no physical trail left by any third party. That theory began to lose traction. Then came the discovery that shifted the direction of the case: a handwritten Valentine's Day card, penned by Susan to John. At first glance, it looked like any other card between a long-married couple. But as officers read the message inside, they realized its tone was not romantic. It was complicated. Obviously, Susan had written, "I bought this before last Monday, so I guess now it doesn't seem as appropriate. I do still love you, though. Have a good day. Susan." It wasn't the message of someone blissfully in love. It was the voice of someone who felt betrayed, someone still holding on, but barely. For investigators, the note posed a pivotal question: what had happened the Monday before? Detectives turned to Susan's closest friends for insight. And it was there, in those quiet, private interviews, that a disturbing possibility surfaced. One of her confidants revealed something that cast a new shadow over the Hamiltons' seemingly perfect union. Susan believed John had been unfaithful. This friend said Susan had confided that she was troubled by something she had discovered: a phone call, a voicemail, or perhaps behavior that no longer felt right. She hadn't gone into great detail, but it was enough to make her friend concerned. Enough, it seemed, to cast doubt on everything the couple had built over nearly 2 decades. The carefully cultivated image of Dr. John Hamilton as a loving husband and devoted partner began to unravel with alarming speed, cracking open a reality far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Behind the polished exterior, behind the smiling holiday photos and yearly Valentine's Day rituals, investigators discovered a story filled with emotional control, disillusionment, and a woman quietly suffocating inside what appeared to be a perfect marriage. It began with a single confession, one made not to police or the media, but to someone far more personal. Susan had opened up to her daughter, expressing that her marriage had become deeply unfulfilling. In her own words, she said she felt trapped, describing her relationship with John as one-sided and emotionally draining. She said everything in their lives revolved around John: his schedule, his needs, his ego. Susan, once known for her compassion and vibrant personality, felt invisible in her own home. She told her daughter that her opinions were routinely dismissed, her feelings minimized, and her existence reduced to that of a passive observer in her own life. At one point, she confided she was contemplating something unthinkable for a woman so devoted to faith and family: leaving the marriage entirely. This quiet, personal revelation, shared only with those closest to her, began to paint a far more complex picture of a relationship that, from the outside, had appeared nearly storybook. The home, the vacations, the romantic gestures, they were now being viewed through an entirely different lens. The illusion of the ideal marriage began to disintegrate. Detectives, driven by inconsistencies in John's statements and compelled by Susan's emotional distress, continued digging. What they found next deepened their suspicions. Among Susan's personal effects, investigators discovered documentation she had printed, phone records that showed more than 60 calls to the same woman. Not a colleague, not a patient in need, but a woman who worked at a local entertainment venue. Susan had noticed the frequency of the calls and the times they occurred, often late in the evening or during hours when John claimed to be working. She confronted him. According to close friends, Susan directly asked John about the woman. His response was dismissive. He claimed she was merely a patient, someone he had consulted for medical reasons. But Susan was unconvinced. Her intuition, sharpened by years of emotional neglect, told her something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was confirmation. And according to one of her closest friends, Susan had made a decision. She was going to leave. She was planning to speak with a divorce attorney. That conversation may have marked the final turning point. By early February, she had begun taking steps toward freedom, emotionally preparing to detach from a relationship that no longer fulfilled or respected her. It was a process she did not take lightly. Susan had long viewed marriage as sacred, but at some point, preservation of self became more important than preservation of image. And John? He stood to lose everything. Not just his wife, but his status as a respected doctor, his carefully curated public reputation, the beautiful home, the social prestige. Divorce could bring financial scrutiny, public embarrassment, even damage to his medical license if scandal erupted. So, by the time February 14th arrived, the day traditionally reserved for love and affection, the Hamiltons were standing at the edge of something far more volatile. What had once been a celebration of their bond had now become a tense, symbolic dance. That morning's gestures, flowers, a card, a routine visit home, now seemed less like sincere offerings of love and more like desperate attempts to maintain control over a situation rapidly slipping away. Behind the tall gates and manicured lawn, a storm was brewing, one that had been gathering silently for years. When it finally broke, it shattered more than a marriage. It tore apart a community's faith in appearances. As detectives continued piecing together the timeline, the evidence, and the psychology behind Susan's final days, The image of Dr. John Hamilton as a heartbroken husband gave way to something far more unsettling. The emotional portrait forming was of a man under pressure, a man facing the collapse of his personal life, potentially driven by fear, shame, and the unbearable idea of public disgrace. Though John denied any inappropriate relationship with the woman Susan had questioned, investigators weren't convinced. Their search uncovered multiple visits to the club where she worked. Witnesses confirmed that John had frequented the establishment, and not just as a casual observer. According to statements gathered during the investigation, the woman had performed private dances for him on several occasions. John would later try to walk back his actions, claiming that nothing physical ever occurred. He insisted it was harmless, that he had done nothing wrong. But in the eyes of the investigators, his defense felt more like damage control than truth. A particularly incriminating detail was a letter John had written to the woman, an official-looking note stating that he could no longer serve as her doctor. At first glance, it seemed like an act of professional integrity. But to police, it felt like a calculated move to cover tracks. Was he trying to earn back Susan's trust? Or was he trying to create a paper trail that would protect him if the relationship were ever questioned publicly? The letter became a key piece of evidence, suggesting that John wasn't just reacting. He was planning, strategizing, attempting to mitigate fallout. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the investigation and the story exploded. Local news teams swarmed the neighborhood. Reporters filed daily updates, tracking every twist and turn. One TV station even sent the 911 call John had made to a voice stress analyst, a controversial but sometimes used tool in criminal profiling. The results were eye-opening. According to the analysis, John's voice during the call displayed an unusually low level of stress, not typical for someone who had just stumbled upon a traumatic scene. Instead of panic or heartbreak, his tone came across as oddly controlled, even measured. It raised an uncomfortable question. Had he rehearsed what to say? But that wasn't all. John had told emergency responders that he had performed CPR in an attempt to save Susan. Yet forensics painted a different picture. There were no visible signs on John's face or mouth. That would be consistent with real attempts to resuscitate someone with significant trauma. The lack of those indicators cast serious doubt on his claim. Then came the most damning evidence of all. A thorough forensic sweep of John's car uncovered more than just faint traces of DNA. There were tissue fragments, material that suggested more than incidental contact. John's initial explanation had been that he moved the car slightly to make space for the ambulance. But that did not explain the biological material found inside. Investigators now believed that Susan or injury-related evidence had been transferred into the vehicle, either directly or by John's own hands. The discovery completely changed the trajectory of the case. It suggested post-crime movement, or worse, an effort to dispose of or alter evidence. For the team building a timeline and motive, the picture had become painfully clear. As the investigation intensified, detectives needed more than suspicion. They needed scientific clarity. To gain that, they brought in one of the nation's leading forensic experts in bloodstain pattern analysis. The hope was that this neutral, data-driven approach could either confirm or disprove the official narrative. What the expert uncovered, however, turned the case on its head. The blood patterns on Dr. John Hamilton's clothing, specifically the fine mist-like spatter on his shirt and sleeves, did not match the story he had told authorities. According to John, he had arrived home, found his wife unresponsive, and immediately attempted CPR. If that were true, the blood would have shown patterns of transfer or smears, typical of a panicked rescue attempt. But that's not what the forensic team found. Instead, the blood patterns were consistent with someone present during the moment of impact, someone close to the act itself. The evidence didn't suggest a man who stumbled upon a terrible tragedy. It suggested someone who may have been in the very center of it. At this point, investigators had formed a working theory, one they hoped the evidence would either support or refute. It was a grim hypothesis, that Susan Hamilton's death was not the result of a random break-in or a crime of opportunity, but the outcome of deep emotional turmoil, a personal, intimate, and tragic explosion of rage. The nature of the act itself offered insight. It wasn't a quick or calculated incident. It bore the hallmarks of overkill, a term used in criminology to describe cases where the force used far exceeds what would be necessary. That, detectives knew, often pointed to personal motivation, not random violence. And motive, in this case, was taking shape. There was the affair, or at the very least, a highly inappropriate relationship between John and a woman he had contacted repeatedly. There was the growing marital discord, well documented through Susan's conversations with friends and family. There were financial concerns, reputation anxiety, and the threat of a public divorce. A possible scandal that could unravel everything John had built. All of it pointed to one central truth. This was not a spontaneous event, but one preceded by growing tension and emotional distance. Detectives then revisited the timeline. On the morning of February 14th, John performed an early surgery at the hospital. He then claimed to have returned home only to drop off a bouquet and a Valentine's Day card for Susan, continuing a long-standing tradition. But new findings suggested he had returned not just to deliver flowers, but to confront his wife. The argument that may have ensued would mark the fatal breaking point. Based on the medical examiner's timeline and witness statements, Susan had been getting ready to leave the house. She had a 9:30 a.m. appointment with a close friend. When she was found, she was fully dressed. Her hair still damp, as though she had just come from the shower. Her makeup bag was open. The flat iron was still warm. She had been in the middle of her morning routine, but she never made it out the door. Detectives uncovered a critical discrepancy in John's hospital records. His second surgery was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m., but John didn't arrive until 9:38 a.m., nearly 40 minutes late. It was such an unusual delay that hospital staff actually sent someone to find him. Those 30-plus unexplained minutes became a focal point of the case. According to prosecutors, it was during this narrow window that the crime occurred. John returned home, confronted Susan, and in the intensity of that moment, the situation escalated into something irreversible. He may have intended to intimidate or argue, but something snapped. The tragedy unfolded. What investigators believed happened next only deepened the sense of horror. John, now in a panic, realized he had little time before he would be missed at the hospital. He changed out of his stained clothing, possibly made attempts to clean up, and rushed back to his professional duties, where he performed a surgical procedure as though nothing had happened. It was chilling to think about. The composure, the ability to compartmentalize, to scrub in, steady his hands, and operate on a patient just moments after what prosecutors alleged was an act of irreversible. Hours later, he would return to the scene and dial 911. The call, while emotionally charged on the surface, would later be examined by voice stress analysts, who concluded that his voice showed unusually low stress indicators. This finding wasn't used as definitive evidence, but became part of a pattern, one that raised doubts about the authenticity of his emotional state. A pivotal moment in the case came during trial preparations when John's own defense team hired an independent bloodstain expert, hoping that the analysis might challenge the prosecution's version of events. But the gamble backfired in the most unexpected way. When the defense expert took the stand, he was asked a routine question. Had the prosecution missed anything significant? What he revealed stunned everyone in the courtroom. He had found small but clear bloodstains inside the sleeve of John Hamilton's dress shirt, stains consistent with cast-off from a swinging motion, not CPR. According to his analysis, the blood had traveled inward, suggesting that John's hand had been extended. The implications were devastating for the defense. Even their own expert could not deny the forensic truth. The blood told its own story, and it directly contradicted the narrative John had offered from the beginning. In court, the jury listened to hours of detailed testimony, medical timelines, forensic breakdowns, emotional accounts from family and friends. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. What emerged was a picture of a man at a crossroads, facing emotional rejection, possible financial fallout, and the unraveling of his carefully controlled world. The motive was not money, nor jealousy, nor passion. It was ego, pride, the crushing fear of humiliation. And the verdict? Swift and final. John Hamilton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In addition, the court ordered him to pay over $11,000 to cover the cost of his incarceration, an unusual but symbolic gesture underscoring the finality of the judgment. It was a landmark case in Oklahoma County, one that rattled the public's trust in appearances and raised difficult questions about how easily darkness can hide behind status and charm. Since then, John has filed multiple appeals. Each one has been reviewed. Each one has been denied. To this day, he maintains his innocence. He has never confessed. And while the vast majority accept the verdict, a small group of loyal supporters continues to believe that the case against him was circumstantial, that the truth, perhaps, is more complicated than anyone knows. But for most, the evidence spoke clearly. The question that still lingers in the background is not whether the system worked. It is whether anyone truly saw the storm coming. Whether Susan, in her final days, realized just how far someone might go to preserve a lie.